Welcome to episode 10 of Arguing the OE. Lieutenant Colonel Perez here at the U.S. Army Commanding General Staff College. And the topic for today I'll be discussing will be the integration of 4 distinct planning practices. So here's the situation in the classrooms here at the college. We expose students to 4 different practices, and it's not always clear how these practices are related in terms of bringing a plan together. And the 4 practices I'm talking about include design, which in the joint community is known as operational design, and within the Army community it's known as Army design methodology. For today I'll simply refer to design. We're also going to talk about critical factor analysis, or as some people refer to it, COG as in center of gravity, COG-CV as in critical vulnerability analysis. We'll also talk about the Universal Joint Task List and doctrine, and consulting those documents as a 3rd practice. And then there's a 4th practice of detailed planning, which in the joint community we know by the familiar acronym of JOPP, and within the Army community we know as MDMP. So in the classrooms we expose students to these 4 practices, but afterwards the students don't seem to understand how each of these 4 distinct practices are integrated and how they can help us think about creating courses of action for our planning. I'm going to start with the operational approach. And this is a model of an operational approach taken from a joint publication 5-0, and it's pretty familiar. You'll find these in the base order to many operations that we conduct. For example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the base orders from the highest echelons all the way down to battalions often included something like an operational approach, which encompass some such things as lines of effort, if we're dealing with conceptual lines, and lines of operation, if we're dealing with geographic lines. This will often include conditions such that each line of effort or line of operation, once the objectives along them are achieve certain conditions on the ground which are desirable. We add up all our conditions for each of the lines of effort or operation, and we get our end state. So all the conditions add up together equal an end state. And then arrayed along each of these lines of operation, we'll find at the joint level objectives. Some of our coalition partners and some persons within the U.S. Army will call this, or in the joint community will call this decisive points. We may put objectives along this in the joint community and call one of these, or 2 of these, or 3 of these decisive points. Doctrine is not very specific about how we do these, but we're going to stick with basic objectives for now. And then we can list and describe what each of these objectives are. And here in this model, I've listed 25 objectives. What I'm going to argue is that we can unify these 4 different practices by focusing on developing our objectives. Once we come up with our objectives, we'll have a way of unifying these 4 practices. So let's begin. Our first practice is design. And we've had 5 episodes dedicated to design. And what we find is that the commander and his staff and unified action partners, through collaboration and dialogue, through the competition of ideas, will enable the commander to do his understanding and visualization. And at the end of this practice of design, which is actually continuing, but at the end of a certain stopping point, the commander may say the following: look, in this operation we're about to do, I want to have 2 lines of effort. Okay? And I want these lines of effort to attain these conditions. And they'll say what they are. And I also want, along these lines of effort, these 4 objectives. These things I want to accomplish. So then, actually, let's say 5. So we'll list them all out. And at the end of a certain portion of design, the commander is now prepared to give his staff some specific guidance. 2 lines of effort, 2 conditions partially defined, and then 5 objectives. This is a good starting point for the planning staff to get on with the process of detailed planning with JOPP or MDMP. So we now know, with our operational approach, where 5 of these objectives are going to come from. So we can circle these right here. These objectives 1 through 5 come from design. There's a second practice that we teach and that joint doctrine talks about. And it's called critical factor analysis or COG-CV analysis. And the way it's described is that there's such a thing as a center of gravity, and that for the center of gravity we identify certain critical capabilities. And let's take one of these critical capabilities. For each of these, we will do the following. We'll identify certain critical requirements that are necessary to achieve, to perform the critical capability. And then we'll examine our critical requirements and see if there's any weaknesses. We may find out that there's here certain weaknesses, critical vulnerabilities, CV1, CV2, and then let's say we find 5 weaknesses or vulnerabilities. Now, I don't want to focus too much attention today on the center of gravity concept. It's very contestable, whether you're talking to faculty here at the college, or you're talking to students, or you're talking to practitioners out in the field. Military professionals mean different things by the center of gravity, and in a future episode we'll explore what these are. But for now, what I want to focus on is on entities. So let's say I'm looking at friendly forces. I'll call this a blue forces. Whenever I do an operation, I'm certain that I want to identify my own vulnerabilities as a blue force, as a coalition force. And in order to do that, I'm going to specify all the things that my force is able to do. And then I'm going to specify the requirements. What are the things that are necessary for me to do those? And then the vulnerabilities, what are the weaknesses inherent in some of these capabilities and requirements. What's an example? Well, in the counterinsurgency that we're involved in Afghanistan since 9/11, one of the things that we've tried to do is conduct partnered operations. So this critical capability here might be conduct partnered operations. Now, to do that, obviously we need weapons, we need uniforms, we need trained partners, but we also need something like trust. So trust could be a critical requirement of conducting partnered operations. And what we've seen over the past couple of years especially is that the Taliban has been able to create and exploit a weakness, create and exploit a vulnerability that we have in terms of green on blue attacks. So what you'll find is that the Taliban will don coalition or Afghan uniforms, go into an area, and then inflict harm and death upon coalition and Afghan partners. Well, what this does is it reduces the amount of trust that we have. And so you see that the Taliban are actually doing some very effective planning. By doing green on blue attacks, it causes the trust to go down, which weakens the capability of conducting partner operations between blue forces and Afghan partners. So I do this not only for my own forces in order to identify weaknesses. I want to do this also for the adversary, so red forces. I want to identify what their critical capabilities are, what their critical requirements are, and what their critical vulnerabilities are. So I'll do the same algorithm that I followed here in order to determine what the vulnerabilities are. So let's say I do this work and I find out that there's 5 CVs that the red forces have. So CV1 all the way through CV number 5. And then I'm going to do it a third time. Okay. Given the fact that land operations and in military operations in general are all not only destructive but also constructive, we need to think about the host nation government, or we can call this green, the green entity. We are always trying to achieve stability and a better set of political conditions on the ground, and the military always contributes to that end. So war is destructive, but it's also constructive. Because of this, we need to be attentive to the fact that we're going to leave an area once we've deployed there. In order to leave, we have to have good conditions on the ground. We're going to depend upon the host nation government for instituting these conditions with our help. So in order to do this, we need to be cognizant of the critical vulnerabilities that the host nation has. So once again, we'll do the same work that we did over here. And we'll identify the vulnerabilities. Okay. Now, once we do this work, we want to talk it over as a staff with the commander, and we're going to say that, okay, blue forces, we've identified 5 vulnerabilities, and because they're blue, because they're ours, we want to protect these vulnerabilities. We want to protect the enemy from exploiting these vulnerabilities. We look at the red forces vulnerabilities. We think about them, discuss them with the commander and the staff officers and unified action partners, and we decide that we're going to exploit or attack these vulnerabilities. And then again, we do the same thing. Host nation government, we have identified what the vulnerabilities are, and because these are our partners, we want to protect these vulnerabilities. So then we go back to our list of objectives. We've already created 1 through 5. These objectives here come from design. We're going to say that 6 through 10, these objectives are intended to protect our critical vulnerabilities. We're going to say that objectives 11 through 15 are intended to exploit the enemy's critical vulnerabilities. And then we're going to say that objectives 16 through 20 are intended to protect the host nation's critical vulnerabilities. So you can see how, so far, by determining where our objectives come from in the operational approach, we're able to unify 2 distinct practices, design and critical factor analysis. And the other thing we want to do is consult the Universal Joint Task List and our Joint and Army Doctrine. And we do this in terms of a priority, where design, according to doctrine, is the foundation of and underpins our operations. So this is the commander's guidance to the staff. It's his conceptual work, his understanding, his visualization, so that the detailed planning can be informed by what the commander wants. We also do critical factor analysis, right? And then third in order, I argue, is the consultation of doctrine to include the Universal Joint Task List. After we've come up with these objectives, we then ask ourselves, is there anything we're missing? Given that our doctrine and the Universal Joint Task List are repositories for our thinking and our experiences in fighting and operating across the range of military operations for decades, it's wise to consult the Universal Joint Task List and doctrine to see if we've missed anything. And then fourth, so Universal Joint Task List and doctrine, let's say we review this and we come up with 3 objectives. 21, 22, 23. There are things that we missed before, but there are things that doctrine specifies that, hey, we need to do this. So we'll include those. And then the fourth thing we're going to do is detailed planning, which is JOPP or MDMP. As we execute detailed planning, we are likely going to come up with more objectives. And an example would be during a wargaming session. We may come across an objective that we have not yet specified, but something that we need to accomplish given what we found out during wargaming. So here, in detailed planning, say wargaming, we come up with 2 more objectives to add to our list. So 24 and 25 come from JOPP and MDMP. Here we have now a complete operational approach wherein the 25 objectives that we came up with are derived from 4 planning practices, which include design, critical factor analysis, doctrine, and detailed planning via JOPP and MDMP. Hope this is helpful. Thank you.